Good afternoon to you from BBC1. In a couple of minutes, we once more revive a few memories from the 1950s when we show the short interlude film about the potter's wheel. To take us there, some music which was often heard on BBC television in the 1960s. It's called Blue Part Invention. News Afternoon follows in just over 5 minutes. On BBC1 before that, here's an interlude film from the early 1950s, Potter's Wheel from Guildford, Surrey. The next interlude film from BBC Television's past is rather more modern. First used as a bridge between children's programmes in 1971, it's all about Goonie birds taking off, and it begins this afternoon at 4:15. Now, News Afternoon with Richard Whitmore and Maurice Stewart. The time is 1 o'clock.
Hello, good afternoon. Thursday's headlines: Israel has totally rejected President Reagan's new plan for the Middle East. A Belfast city councillor is in intensive care after being shot by gunmen who broke into his home. And the steel unions are up in arms over a steel board questionnaire which asks which works risk being closed.
After the solidarity demonstrations in Poland, we ask a Polish diplomat if his government in Warsaw can really pass them off as rowdyism. We talked to Roy Jenkins about the Social Democrat Party's ideas for reforming the trade unions, published this morning. And we have a report on medical research into one of the most common and tragic accidents to new babies, cot death.
First, though, the Israeli cabinet has totally rejected President Reagan's new peace plan for the Middle East. The decision came after a 3-hour cabinet meeting in Jerusalem. Israel's deputy prime minister said the proposals would inevitably lead to the establishment of a Palestinian state, even if that was not intended. Under the Reagan plan, the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza would be given self-government and would be linked to Jordan. Mr. Begin is to discuss the rejection with the American Defense Secretary, Mr. Caspar Weinberger, whom he'll be meeting in Jerusalem this afternoon. The West Bank, the bigger of the occupied territories covered by the Reagan plan, was set aside under a post-war UN plan for a Palestinian homeland. But after annexation by Jordan in the 50s, it was captured by Israel in the 1967 war. The population of the West Bank is overwhelmingly Arab. There are 2/3 of them. The Israelis have some 20,000 settlers and a strong occupying force to counter persistent Arab unrest. The smaller occupied territory, Gaza, was also captured by Israel in 1967. After the establishment of the State of Israel, the coastal strip had to absorb 200,000 Arab refugees and has been described as the biggest refugee camp in the world. It's under Israeli military rule.
Good. President Reagan interrupted a holiday at his California ranch to make last night's speech. And while calling for a freeze on further Israeli settlement on the West Bank, he ended it by saying that America's commitment to Israel was ironclad. From Washington, Martin Bell.
President Reagan called for a fresh start and a new realism by both Israel and the Arabs. And he went beyond the original Camp David agreements in which the United States was just a neutral mediator. He set out some ideas of his own of how to carry the peace process forward, what the United States would support and what it would not support. What it would not support first.
So the United States will not support the establishment of an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and we will not support annexation or permanent control by Israel. There is, however, another way to peace. The final status of these lands must, of course, be reached through the give and take of negotiations. But it is the firm view of the United States that self-government by the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza, in association with Jordan, offers the best chance for a durable, just, and lasting peace.
This was an invitation to Jordan to join the peace process.
It is the United States position that in return for peace, the withdrawal provision of Resolution 242 applies to all fronts, including the West Bank and Gaza. When the border is negotiated between Jordan and Israel, our view on the extent to which Israel should be asked to give up territory will be heavily affected by the extent of true peace and normalization and the security arrangements offered in return. Tonight, on the eve of what can be a dawning of new hope for the people of the troubled Middle East, and for all the world's people who dream of a just and peaceful future, I ask you, my fellow Americans, for your support and your prayers in this great undertaking. Thank you, and God bless you.
The president was calling for compromise by both sides. From the Israelis, no annexation of the West Bank, no further settlements, and magnanimity in their dealings with the Arabs. From the Arabs, above all, a recognition of Israel's right to exist. The proposals were put forward rather hurriedly and before there could be any further hardening of position by either side. They were conveyed to Saudi Arabia, to Israel, to Egypt, and to Jordan, but not to the PLO, with whom the United States is still refusing to deal directly.
Israel's rejection of Mr. Reagan's plan had been expected, and so far there's been no official statement after the cabinet meeting. But the Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. David Levy, said Israel was not looking for a confrontation with Washington and would do all it could to avoid one while sticking firmly to its position.
The cabinet met in special session for more than 3 hours, but most of the time was taken up by ministers' speeches, and there was never any doubt that what is variously being put as President Reagan's ideas or his proposals or his plan would be entirely rejected. This has in fact happened. Upon emerging from the cabinet meeting, Deputy Prime Minister David Levy said that the government completely rejects the proposals because they would lead to a Palestinian state, even if this was not the intention of the president.
But how has the Reagan plan been received by the people it most concerns, the people living on the West Bank, both Arab and Jew? There are now about 85 Israeli settlements in the area containing 25,000 people. John Four of CBS News went to one which opened only yesterday and found much bitterness.
For Israel, though, the most offensive part of the letter is Mr. Reagan's effort to stop all new Jewish settlements on the West Bank, such as this one dedicated today. This is the cornerstone of Reagan's West Bank policy, and government officials insist that nothing in Camp David prevents the government from building these whenever and wherever it wants, regardless of what President Reagan thinks.
I think that if he came here and he saw how important these settlements were and how close to Jerusalem and the people who were living here these settlements were, he would realize how essential they are.
Some Arabs are pleased by what they think is a willingness in Washington to put pressure on Jerusalem, but a former Jordanian minister with ties to King Hussein says the proposals will go nowhere.
The Palestinians, King Hussein, any Arab party will not be involved in the Camp David process. And I think this is very clear.
Here at home, the Defence Secretary, John Nott, wouldn't make any comment today about his decision announced yesterday to give up his seat in Parliament at the next general election. He appeared briefly outside the Ministry of Defence this morning, but that was simply to welcome New Zealand's Prime Minister. Clive Ferguson was there.
Mr. Nott's first public appearance after his announcement was an official one, awaiting the arrival of the New Zealand Prime Minister, though Mr. Nott was the centre of attention for reporters. But Mr. Nott wouldn't be drawn by any of the questions shouted to him.
Nothing more to say on that subject.
Can you tell us when you might have something more to say, sir? Although he confirmed that he would continue carrying out his duties as Defence Minister, such as discussing the Falklands with Robert Muldoon today, it now seems likely that with the report of the inquiry into the Falklands due in December, it will not be long before someone else leads visiting foreign dignitaries up the steps of the Ministry of Defence.
And senior government officials from Italy, West Germany, France and Britain are expected to meet in London tomorrow to coordinate strategy over the controversial Soviet pipeline. Today, one of President Reagan's top trade officials has been having talks with the British government about the pipeline. Michael Cole reports.
Bill Brock on the left spent an hour with Britain's Trade Minister Peter Rees. There'd been some frank talking, but despite the smiles, no real shift in the American view that sanctions against the Soviets should supersede British trade. So I asked Mr. Brock just how bad were relations between our two countries.
We have such enormous respect for Mrs. Thatcher and her government and the people of this country that it is painful, but it is the kind of pain that occurs when good friends have a modest disagreement on the tactics. We don't disagree on, as Mr. Rees has said, on our larger goal. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind. While we may have a temporary problem ultimately we will stay together and work this problem out.
Many Prime Minister said she has been deeply hurt. Is that how the administration, is that how President Reagan feels?
We are concerned, obviously, with the reaction of good friends, and we feel very strongly that this should be a good reason for us to get back together and work in common purpose.
I didn't get the impression that, friendly though he was, Ambassador Brock is armed with the authority to say, no, we're going to make a special exception for John Brown, or we're going to take the sanctions off Dresser. I'm afraid that that's a decision that will be taken at the very highest level, and I would suspect, but it's only a suspicion, that the President's position is involved a little bit here.
The Americans won't announce what action they intend to take against John Brown Engineering until the Soviet freighter carrying the first 6 turbines actually leaves the Clyde. But it seems clear the Americans are prepared to soften their sanctions. Only equipment relating to the oil and gas industries will be denied to the Clydebank Company. However, anything less than a total abandonment of sanctions wouldn't have satisfied the British government. So this difficult period in British-American relations is likely to go on for quite some time yet, to the mutual discomfort of President Reagan and his most loyal ally in Europe, Mrs. Thatcher.
The Social Democrats accuse the trade union movement in Britain of being leaderless, deeply split, and unable to drag itself into the last quarter of the 20th century. In a discussion document that's not yet party policy, the Social Democrats make a list of proposals for union reform. Among the new ideas are
a fund to help union mergers, making union dues tax deductible, and on political levies, union members would have to contract in. It suggested ballots should be compulsory for choosing general secretaries and executive members, with secret ballots on strikes and ballots on party affiliation. The discussion paper says there should be a ban on pre-entry closed shops, ballots on post-entry closed shops and help for people dismissed on conscience grounds, and a law would make recalcitrant employers recognise unions and compulsory arbitration in strikes in essential services.
Well, the Social Democrat leader, Roy Jenkins, is now with our political editor, John Cole, at the party's headquarters.
Mr. Jenkins, you make strongly the point that you're not an anti-trade union party, but you are proposing quite a lot of legal intervention in the trade union movement, elections and ballot votes and the political levy and the closed shop and compulsory arbitration in some industries and so on. Is that not a considerable intervention?
It's an intervention, but it's not a hostile intervention. It doesn't believe that everything can be done by law. There are a lot of places where we say it would be desirable if things happened in this way, but you can't do it all by law, and we don't propose to do it by law. But equally, I don't think you can take the view. The trade union movement is too important in itself, too important in its impact upon the economic and indeed the political life of the country, to believe that it can be completely outside the law in a way that companies are not, for instance. And indeed the law does impact upon trade unions in several ways, obvious ways, at the present time. And I can't take the view that certain legal intervention in trade union affairs is anti-trade union. I think there are provisions in our plans which are pro-trade union.
But is it anti-trade union leadership? I mean, you do rather make the point that you want to restore the trade unions to their members. Implicitly, isn't that going to antagonize the trade union leaders and make any kind of national concordat with them impossible?
I don't think so necessarily. Sometimes, I mean, the leaders themselves would much prefer to see responsible rank-and-file opinion, broad rank-and-file opinion, emerging clearly, rather than finding themselves in the hands of a limited number of unrepresentative militants. But anyway, I think that trade union democracy is a very important principle, and there's no doubt at all that election of officers, election of general secretaries by secret ballot will produce, I think, a much more representative result. I mean, there are some unions where the executives are elected with a participation of about 2.5% of the membership, and nobody can call that democracy. I think this drive towards democracy will be acceptable by the majority of responsible trade union officers.
So you would still have some hope of getting a deal on incomes, for example, with the unions?
Well, I hope that the unions will see that you must have a constructive approach to incomes policy if you are going to have a sustained expansion of the economy which will get unemployment well down. I don't believe in a sort of social contract deal in which the government offers certain legislative things, say the nationalization of some industry, which it doesn't really believe in return for the trade unions trying to deliver wage restraint, because mostly they can't wholly deliver it.
Yeah, now, to implement these policies, indeed your other policies, you need to get elected in a general election. There's a public opinion poll by Marplan in The Guardian this morning which suggests the Conservatives are falling back, but to the benefit of Labour rather than yourself. How do you propose to reverse that trend?
Well, we propose to reverse that trend by a very sustained campaign throughout this autumn. As you know very well, over the past 2 years, you've seen a great fluctuation in opinions in a whole variety of directions. Now, opinion polls to some extent indicate what's happening. They don't tell you the whole truth, and they certainly don't tell you an immutable truth. If that was so, I wouldn't be a member of Parliament at the present time, because in each of the 2 elections I fought, one of which I just lost, one of which I just won, the public opinion polls were telling a totally different story 2 weeks beforehand from what actually happened. So I regard that public opinion poll as a spur to us to make sure that we project ourselves as an alliance and the policies such as those we are putting forward today in a way that I believe will put us back in a position of challenge equivalent to that of a year ago.
Mr. Jenkins, thank you.
In Belfast, a city councillor is still critically ill in hospital after being shot in his home. Councillor Billy Dixon, a member of Ian Paisley's Democratic Unionist Party, had announced that he was to stand in next month's Assembly elections in the province. The Irish National Liberation Army have said they carried out the attack on him. This report by James Robbins.
The whole terrace of houses where Councillor Dixon lives was caught up in the attack. The terrorists shot him several times, then left a bomb outside the councillor's home as they fled. They were clearly determined to murder him. They brought with them a sledgehammer to smash down the front door, terrifying Mr. Dixon's wife, Anne, who ran out to try to save her husband.
I heard the gate open and I got up, and I said, Billy is at the gate. And I think he was making his way towards the vestibule door when the front door was bashed in and the vestibule door was smashed in and the shots just rang out. And then I just shouted, Billy, you're shot. And he says, I'm not. He sort of pushed me back into the living room. And then he pushed me into the working kitchen in himself. And he was leaning up against the door. I could see his back and the blood was coming out of it.
The DUP councillor, who's 35, is still critically ill with several bullet wounds. An outspoken critic of Republican terrorism, he intended standing in next month's election to the new Northern Ireland Assembly established by Secretary of State James Pryor. This was the 3rd serious attack on Belfast City councillors in the past 2 years. A fellow unionist is confined to a wheelchair. Last year, a prominent Republican was shot and killed. There's little doubt this attack was designed to interfere with the democratic process, to fight with the bullet rather than through the ballot box. But Councillor Dixon's political colleague